I'm delighted to be joined by Rob Galanders, professor at the DCU Anti-Corruption Research Centre, and Roberto Kukushka, who, will correct me if I'm wrong, is Senior Research Coordinator or Manager at Transparency International in Berlin, and is responsible for our measurement tools, including the Global Corruption Barometer, as a role to play, I think, too, in the formulation of the Corruption Perceptions Index. I'm John Devitt. I'm Chief Executive of TI Ireland. And what we do for the next hour or so is present the findings of the Global Corruption Barometer European Union. It's the first Global Corruption Barometer published for Ireland, or covering Ireland, I think, in 10 years. And we'll then, having listened to an overview from Roberto, I'll give you an overview of some of the highlights from Ireland, and then we'll turn to Rob for his observations and have a discussion with questions from you to help us move the conversation along. So I should start, for those who aren't familiar with Transparency International. A handful of you joined might not be all that familiar with the work we do, but TI is a global organization, non-profit, non-partisan, with chapters in around 100 countries, and its international secretariat based in Berlin. TI Ireland itself was founded in 2004, and as you probably know, we operate a helpline for whistleblowers, run a program aimed at creating safe working environments for people to speak up called Integrity at Work, and we also undertake research, most recently a National Integrity Index, the private sector, that looked at the disclosure practices of 30 Irish leading companies. We also launched a report called Safe Haven, looking at money laundering risks and how the state recovers the proceeds of corruption, international corruption in Ireland. And of course, then we publish every year the Corruption Perceptions Index, and delighted to have had a chance to publish the Global Corruption Barometer this year, and to see Ireland covered in it for the first time. So I will hand over to Roberto. I don't want to take up too much more time. And Roberto, if you'd like to share your slides, and I will leave it to you. Thanks, Roberto.
Perfect. Am I muted? No. Great. So I hope you can see my slides now. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for having me here today, John. It's great to be able to be here to discuss some of the findings of the Global Corruption Barometer. I thought that, since the report has been out now for like a couple of days, I do not want to just go, point by point or question by question or anything like that. So what I tried to do was to cluster some of the findings that we got across the EU, and then talk about those with some of the key messages and key findings for the region. So I would like to start just by giving a very quick overview of what the Global Corruption Barometer is. So the Global Corruption Barometer is the other side of the coin, so to speak, to our Corruption Perceptions Index. So while the Perceptions Index is based on expert opinions, this is a popular, like a public survey, so to speak. So it's like a general population survey. So this time around, we interviewed over 40,000 people in the 27 countries of the European Union between October and December of 2020. So what we did this time is the Global Corruption Barometer has been conducted since 2003, and it used to be a global survey. but we acknowledge that corruption is different in different regions and that there are different issues that might be important to look deeper into. So as of 2016, we started conducting the survey with a more regional approach. So we started with Africa, moved on to Asia, Latin America, MENA, and now it was like time to cover the European Union. And we keep some of the core questions in the survey, but also adapt some others to cover like the needs of the region or to cover some of the issues that we think would be relevant. So this time around, we also had the opportunity, thanks to the funding of the European Union, to have bigger samples for the survey and cover also not only the national level, but the sub-national level, which is a first for us as Transparency International. And I think what is also important to keep in mind is that we're covering here perceptions of corruption, but also experiences of corruption. So we're looking at both, so to speak, and attitudes as well. So without further ado, just some of the findings that we have at the European level, I cluster them into four. The first one is that there are indeed certain types of corruption, such as bribery, that are very rare in the European Union, or are mostly concentrated in a few countries. But we have discovered that favoritism in public service access and delivery is widespread in the region, even though this is often seen, like the European Union or Europe in general is seen often as like a bastion of good governance and rule of law. We're seeing that there are differences in who gets what and who can access what. The second point that we saw, and that is also like a very special trait, so to speak, from the results in Europe, is that we see concerns from citizens around the close ties between business and governments, and also issues of integrity in the private sector. So this is something that is very specific to this survey, because when we compare it to what we saw in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa, or in the MENA region, there we still see people concerned mostly about corruption in public bodies, in public institutions, and in government. In the European Union, we see people concerned more about the interaction between the public and the private sector. I think we will see in some of the results that perceptions of corruption in government are not like, I mean, in cases are not that high here in the European Union, but this like interaction between the two is concerning for citizens. The third point is that there are certain anti-corruption mechanisms that are perhaps not working as they should. Even though we have them on paper, so to speak, people don't perceive them as, you know, making a difference on the ground, or they are at least failing to convince people that we're doing something against corruption. And finally is the last finding that I think the last message that we get, I think, from these results, is that there is indeed pressure from the people. So like bottom-up pressure, so to speak, to aim at being better at fighting corruption and achieving better governance in the region. So just to go very quickly through some of the results, as I already said, perhaps like some of the staple questions, and one of the questions that we've always had in the survey is the experience of corruption in the shape of bribery, right? And this is one of the questions where the EU always shines, because as we can see here in the graph as well, we have some countries with very, very low levels of bribery. So if we look at Sweden, Finland, and even Estonia, that has been making a lot of progress, we see that, you know, bribery levels remain under, for many of these countries, remain under 5%. Overall, the average for the European Union is 7%, which is by far the lowest that we see in any of the other regions that we covered. But we do see that there's, you know, some areas of concern still. So if we look at the results for Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Lithuania, we still have levels of bribery around the 20%. So I think that also speaks to this like divide, like there are different governance systems, so to speak, within the European Union. Now, for the first time, we also included a question on the use of personal connections to access public services. So this comes from a more like normative understanding of corruption. So what we're trying to do here is to say, okay, you know, public services should operate in a specific way in which every citizen that is entitled to have access to that service should have access to that service, regardless of, you know, who they are, what group they belong to, who they know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's more of this idea that, you know, like in a system of good governance, who you are shouldn't matter in accessing public services, and who you know shouldn't matter either. And what we saw that I thought were like very shocking findings, at least to me, was that a third of people in the region rely on their personal connections to access or to get a public service. And here, you probably suspect that the numbers are highest in the same countries that we saw where bribery was a problem, but this wasn't the case. So we found like very high incidence of use of personal connections in the Czech Republic, but also in France, Portugal, and Belgium, and Austria even. So here, over 40% of people rely on personal connections to get the services they need from the government. So this is 11, like the average on the EU is actually 11 percentage point higher than what we saw, for example, in the results in Asia. So, you know, this is just another way in which people experience corruption in the region. And I think particularly now during COVID times, what is concerning as well is that the service in which we see the use of bribery and personal connections most often is actually the healthcare sector, or access to public clinics and hospitals. So even though, I mean, we see the average for the EU here. So in yellow, we have bribery. It's only 6% on average, but we do have countries like Lithuania, Romania, Bulgaria, or Croatia, where, as I said earlier, this level is actually closer to 20%, so 1 in 5 people. And when we look at the rate of personal connections, we can see that this is much, much higher at EU level, right? So I think this is concerning, especially now that, you know, we already started with a vaccination campaign against COVID and so on. But I think it can raise some red flags that there could be certain groups that are being left out from services due to their lack of connections, or that there are groups that are benefiting from, you know, privileged access. So now we also asked about another practice, which is called sextortion, which is the use of, you know, sexual favors. Requesting sexual favors to access public services. Overall, the rates in Europe weren't as high. I believe for Ireland it was 4%, but those results can also be found in the report and in the survey. Now moving on to the second point that I raised at the beginning. So these notion of close ties between business and politics. This message is coming actually from not just one question in the survey, but from several questions that give us this picture. So for example, we asked people whether they thought that companies relied commonly on money and connections to secure government contracts. And in 16 of the 27 EU countries, a majority of people, so over 50% of respondents, mentioned that this was the case in their country, or that companies very commonly and very often relied on this type of practice to secure government contracts. This included countries like Germany and France, which is concerning given that they're like the economic engine of the union. And, you know, I think that it shows as well that citizens do not, in many of these countries, do not really believe that the economy is working in a fair, competitive manner. So I think whether this is a fact or just perceptions of citizens, I think it is something that needs to be looked into, because it definitely undermines trust in the economy and how it works. Similarly, we also have this idea in 19 of the 27 countries that the government is run by a few big interests, and that governments respond to these big interests rather than to the people, right? So this is, again, whether this is perception or reality, this is coming from somewhere. And I think, like, you know, people will vote following these ideas that they have in their minds. So I think that's why it is also important to tackle this issue. It's also thus not surprising that in many countries you have this reemergence of populism, which is against, you know, neoliberalism, against the economy, against globalization, I think those ideas have, they gained some strength after the global financial crisis, after the EU crisis, and they are still there. So there's still this notion that, people are not benefiting from the current economic system. And when we look at the perceptions of corruption by institution, this is also something very unique about the results that we got in the European Union, which is that in most regions, we often have at the very top of the scale of like who is the most corrupt and so on, we often have governments. So it can be prime ministers, it can be members of parliament, it can be national government officials. In the case of the EU, we do have members of parliament, but this is mostly due to the perceptions in Eastern Europe. In Western Europe, we often have either bankers or business executives at the top of the perception of corruption scale, so to speak. So yeah, you can see also here the results, like the average results for the whole like EU 27 countries by institution, and bankers and business executives take the second and third spot respectively. Now to the third point, what I was talking about, these weaknesses in control mechanisms. Here, this also comes from like a number of questions in the survey. So I think one of the most dramatic findings, I think, is that there is not one single country in the European Union where prosecution against corrupt officials is seen, at least by people, as something that occurs often or regularly, so to speak. Moreover, more than 50% of all respondents in all countries believe that corruption is rarely or never prosecuted, or like people who engage in it do not face consequences on a regular basis. So I think this is not great for a region that often prides itself of being like, a champion of the rule of law. And similarly, and also related to the previous point that I was making in the slide before about this connection between business and governments, and how like citizens feel that there is this influence of business and politics. We have only one country in the European Union where a majority of people answered that they believe that governments consider their views when making important policy decisions. This country is Finland. In all other 26 countries, there seems that it seems that participation and like this idea of like, well, my democratic government is listening to me and representing my my views is not really what's going on for one reason or another. I think that's there's much more research on that and much more research needed, but this is at least what the Global Corruption Barometer found. And also in terms of whistleblowing protection, or the need to have people also reporting corruption when they see it. I think what is concerning is that in 17 of the 27 EU countries, and also despite the fact that the European Union recently passed the whistleblower directive, which is now being transposed, or must be transposed, I think, to national legislation by the end of this year, there is still majorities of people in 17 of the 27 countries that think that they would not be able to safely report corruption. The results also show that women are often feel less secure to report corruption than men do. But I think this is another instance or example of how, despite having some laws in place, these don't seem to be making a difference on the ground. And finally, despite what I've said so far, I think there is some room for optimism, or actually there is a call for action for everybody, since like people really do want to see change and really do want to see things working differently. First, 24 out of the 27 EU member states, people think that they can help make a difference in the fight against corruption, which shows that they are engaged in this topic in a way. And in 25 of the 27 EU member states, we have very big majorities of people telling us that they would not justify corruption in any way, even if it helped the government deliver good results and achieve their objectives. So the only two countries where this wasn't the case were Romania and Lithuania, where public opinion was more divided. But in all other 25 EU member states, we have an average of 73%, so like around 3/4 of the respondents saying that corruption can never be justified. So I think I've taken enough of your time. I hope this was, I mean, there are many more questions in the survey, so go check out the report on the TI website. You can download it from there. And of course, if you have any questions or comments, I'm here. Thank you very much. John, you're muted.
John, you're still on mute. I'm not sure what's happening.
Sorry, it wouldn't let me unmute. It's always very irritating on Zoom. You know you're muted, but you can't. People telling you you're on mute. Anyway, thanks, Roberto. I will just move swiftly on to some of the key highlights for Ireland, although we won't cover them all. We can discuss some of the most important ones. If you just bear with me a moment, I'll share my screen now. And if I can find my slides, I'm at a loss to know where they have gone. Let me see. Why aren't I able to see this? Just bear with me one moment. No, I can't see how I share my screen.
John, if it's any help, I sometimes find if you kind of close down everything else and then literally just open your PowerPoint, that then it'll come up when you go to share a screen.
Close down everything else as
if you have any other Word documents or any other, documents open.
I have millions of documents open, Stephanie.
That wasn't helpful then, was it? Maybe just
let me see. I'll just see if I can just yeah, I'll just see if it works now. Just bear with me a moment. Sorry for this. No, so my PowerPoint has disappeared for some reason. Anyway, what I'll do is I'll just go through.
Yeah, you send it on to me, John. You can start. Send it on to me, and sure, I'll share as soon as I get it.
Sure, yeah, I'll do that now. Yeah, so generally speaking, I think that the results point to some worrying trends across the EU, but they're not necessarily reflected in the findings in Ireland, which are, I'd say, relatively speaking, positive. Nonetheless, there are some findings which I think you will agree that are rather worrying or should be a cause for concern. And we go through some of the key findings here for you now. When the Irish public were asked, and there were 1,000 people surveyed in Ireland, whether they believe corruption is a big problem here, 35% said they believed it is a significant, it is a big problem in government, which in relative terms suggests that fewer Irish people believe that corruption is a problem in comparison to their European neighbours. 35% is close to the response rate from Germany, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Sweden, and Finland. And the lowest response to that question was in Denmark with 12%. When asked whether people, or when asked whether they believe if corruption is on the rise, 23% of people said they believe this was the case. Again, in relative terms, it suggests that fewer Irish people believe that corruption is becoming a bigger problem, or had become a bigger problem over the previous years. And in comparison to 2010, it suggests that fewer people believe that corruption is as big a problem as it was a decade ago, when 60%, I think, of respondents to the Global Corruption Barometer in 2010 said they believed that corruption had increased over the previous 3 years. Now, I would suggest, and we can discuss this further, that this may have a great deal to do with the fact that tribunals of inquiry have ended. There are relatively few cases in the public domain or in the media, or allegations being made or cases being brought by the authorities against senior public officials in the way there were back in 2010, bearing in mind that both Mahon and the Moriarty tribunals concluded in 2012 and 2011, respectively. Relatively few people, comparatively speaking, said that they had paid a bribe over the previous year, with 5% of respondents, Irish respondents, saying that they had paid a bribe to a public official. 4% of people said that they had been pressured into giving sexual favors in return for essential services or to avail of their rights. Happy to come back to this again, but it has been reported recently that this is a low number. It projected across the Irish workforce, 4% of people is in the region of 50,000 people. So if even 1,000 people said that they had been pressured into granting sexual favors by public officials, that is a very significant finding in itself, and it's something that should prompt action and reflection at the policy level by government. The number of people asked if they'd the number of people who'd been asked if they had used personal connections to influence a public official or to access services was much higher than those who had said that they had paid a bribe, with 28%, 1 in 3 people saying that they had used personal connections to either access services in education or in health, and 14% of people said that they had similarly used such personal connections to avoid a fine, to pass, for example, a guarded checkpoint, or to avoid prosecution. So significantly higher than those who would say that they've exchanged money in return for a service. The number of people who said they believe that the state is controlled by a handful of private interests, again, was much higher, with 40% of the Irish public saying that they believe that this was the case. Again, in relative terms, it is much lower than in other EU states, with 70% of people in Slovenia, for example, saying that they believe that the state was controlled by private interest. But again, 40% is not an insignificant number, and it's something that should prompt again some thought on the behalf of policymakers and politicians here too. The number of people saying that they believed that or feared retaliation, or believed that fear was justified retaliation for speaking up, again, was amongst the lowest, with the average EU average being 45%. 33% of Irish people said that they believed that fear was justified in speaking out about corruption. This is in spite of the enactment of relatively progressive whistleblower legislation here in 2014. And the lowest response rate was in Finland, with 12%. The highest was in Cyprus with 76% and in Croatia with 72%. On a more positive note, Ireland, the response rate for those saying they believe that government takes their views into account when making decisions was the second highest in the EU, with 49% of Irish respondents saying that they believed that they were listened to by politicians and policymakers. The highest response rate was in Finland, and the lowest was in Latvia with 13%. And the number of people who said or believed that the government was doing well in the fight against corruption was relatively high too, with 56% of people saying that they believed that the government was taking action against corruption or doing well in the fight against corruption, in contrast to 39% who said they didn't. So like we said already, there are some positive findings from this report, some findings that suggest that we need to take action now, and that our policymakers need to consider the risks of corruption in certain sectors, and that there's no room for complacency in any of these findings. We've pointed more than once to the failure to enact the Public Sector Standards Bill, which would have gone much further than is the case to prevent corruption in public office, which would have required our office holders and political representatives to share much more information in the public domain, to address conflicts of interest, to share details of liabilities or loans as well as assets. And we know from tribunals of inquiry that loans or guarantees of loans have been used to, or that there was a risk of such used to influence politicians, and we know from international experience that loans and guarantees are often used to effectively bribe public officials and politicians. Right now, there is no requirement on public representatives or office holders to declare liabilities. That's something that should be covered in forthcoming ethics legislation, along with a modernized asset disclosure system. Right now, all politicians and office holders need to do is fill in a form which is uploaded on the Standards of Public Office Commission's website, declaring some basic financial interests. So our ethics legislation needs an overhaul. We've called for the reinstatement of this legislation, which came about on foot of the Mahon Tribunal and Mahon Tribunal recommendations. We've also called for more resourcing of existing agencies, including the Gardaí, as well as the foundation of an anti-corruption bureau, which would be dedicated to tackling serious corruption-related offences. In addition, there's a great deal more need to be done to train people in sensitive roles, such as in procurement. We found that over 60% of the public believed that corruption was a feature in public contracting in Ireland. And the Council of Europe group of states against corruption, or GRECO, has recommended that Ireland do more to train public officials in tackling corruption or identifying the risks of corruption and addressing them in public procurement. So there is clearly room for action there. And in addition, Mahon Tribunal had called for public education around the costs of corruption and measures that could be used to address it. And finally, there is some room for optimism, as Roberto pointed to, in the state's response to corruption here. I thought of a report published by the Department of Justice and overseen by the former DPP, James Hamilton. There will be a strategy formulated to tackling this problem, and we look forward to playing a part in informing that too. So no grounds for complacency. There's a great deal more to be done to address the risk of corruption. We've seen with the rise of authoritarian populism across Europe, the risks associated with declining trust in government, and policymakers and public representatives need to be aware of those risks when considering their response to research such as this. So I'm sorry for the technical hiccup there, but I'm sure we'll have questions coming in. But what I'd like to do now is just turn to Rob and ask you, Rob, what you felt were the key or some of the most salient findings here, and what they say about Ireland and what they say about our response to this.
Great. Thanks, John, and thanks, Roberto, for really interesting presentations. I don't have any slides. My students got their grades yesterday, and I have a firm intention to not make any slides until early September at least. So I'm just going to speak off the cuff, as it were. I also want to thank Roberto and John, both as representatives of TI and TI Ireland. I mean, it is important that we recognize what a great benefit both organizations are to the world and to Ireland in particular. We really are better off for having strong organizations such as these. In relation to this particular report, I mean, it has never been more important to chart and map corruption. We know from other viruses in the past the important role that trust in government and perceptions of corruption play, and not just in people's willingness to take vaccines, but in their willingness to do very basic public health things. There's studies from Ebola outbreaks in the Congo, DRC, that show that, you know, kind of compliance with simple public health advice like washing your hands and safe disposal of bodies in an Ebola outbreak decline as people trust the government less. So it is really, really important that we have exercises like TIs to kind of chart and map perceptions of corruption, because, you know, there is this old debate between perceptions of corruption and experiences of corruption, but people act on their perceptions. So when we're starting to talk about how people behave, it is very, very important that we understand how they view their government and how they view their society. That's kind of high level stuff. In particular, focusing on Ireland, the thing that jumped out at me, and John and Roberto both alluded to, is the kind of the contrast between the low bribery rate of 5% and the reasonably high personal connections rate of 28%. And I think this speaks to the importance of one of the recommendations from the Hamilton report, that we broaden out the legal definition of corruption. And, you know, it's not just about paying bribes in brown envelopes. We have to think about all the ways in which people can abuse their public power for private gain, be it through nepotism and hiring, or you know, through helping out your buddies to, as John said, get through checkpoints or get your kids into school. And quite famously, of course, there were allegations that there were some improprieties in queue jumping around the vaccine rollout here in Ireland, that people who had connections might have been able to get that vaccine earlier than others. And I think that's something we need to pay attention to. I don't want to jump out at me, and you know, John might have more insights on this than I would. I mean, I noticed that the place where people were paying, or the context in which people were paying bribes in Ireland was highest in schools, right, or in the context of schools. So 6% of people were paying bribes in context of schools, and that made me think of the ongoing investigations into one of the education and training boards. I can't remember exactly where it is off the top of my head, but it does point, you know, these two facts kind of line up, and, you know, it might be worth thinking more, broadening out investigations such as that. We can't act kind of in a legal sense on data like this, but we can of course use it to guide where we focus our anti-corruption efforts and our investigations going forward. So it's another way in which these kind of scoping exercises, or these kind of mapping exercises, can confer real benefits to society. And both my colleagues spoke about the sextortion data and results. I mean, this is something that we at the Anti-Corruption Research Center at DCU are going to spend a good chunk of the next 3 years thinking about in a kind of a global sense. We view it as being a particularly egregious and harmful form of corruption that's not been sufficiently studied academically, at least to this point. We want to understand more fully the causes and the consequences of sextortion, and it is the best example of a way in which corruption can harm particularly vulnerable groups or already vulnerable groups. So yeah, it was reported that it's it's only about 4% of the population that's experienced it directly or know someone who has. But I that only, or that just, as John pointed out, covers up a huge number of people whose lives can be dramatic, like much more damaged to your life than paying a bribe to get past the checkpoint or something. This is a real problem. We really need to think about it. Numbers are probably biased downwards. Roberto might be able to speak to that, both because people are going to be more reluctant to report having been a victim of a crime such as this, and also because the people who might be most at risk of it might be the people least able to answer a phone poll. So I think this is something we really need to pay a lot of attention at in the country and globally. It's also the case that while the percentage was low in terms of direct experience, there's only 5% of respondents thought it never or rarely happens. So it's something we need to think a lot more about. One, just to seed a controversial point we might discuss later. I mean, the stuff about the inclusive decision making, the government listens to us when they're formulating decisions. We are the second highest. We are the second highest in Europe, as John pointed out, and that's probably a good thing. But of course, our ongoing housing crisis, there's a hefty dose of NIMBYism, and it'd be interesting to tease out, is there good listening to us and bad listening to us, and what sense does our electoral system, which rewards kind of local issues over national issues, play into that? They were the things that jumped out at me about the kind of specifically to Ireland. But the one that not quite kept me awake at night last night thinking about it, but certainly was on my mind for a good chunk of the day, is this idea of the tolerance for corruption in a government that's delivering. I mean, it was 8% in Ireland, 23% in Hungary. I think it was slightly over 50% in Romania. I mean, these are constituencies of kleptocracy. This is public support and not negligible for kleptocratic systems of government. And I think that this is probably one of the greatest threats to the European Union and to our ability to enjoy our lives the way we like to enjoy them in a longer time frame. I really, really hope that this is something that the EU and other relevant parties hear and we continue to track. Because even in the EU's own surveying of public opinions on corruption, the Barometer, if we take Ireland's numbers from 2017, 2019, and the question of, it's never acceptable to give money or do a gift or do a favor to kind of corrupt public officials. The numbers are high, right? So 83% of people think it's never acceptable to give money. But it used to be 88% 2 years ago. Likewise, for giving a gift, it's gone from 81 to 77 in 2 years, and 84 to 78 for doing a favor. Now, look, there's measurement error. These are not huge collapses. But again, the importance of stopping your corruption norms from falling means that we need to keep a very close eye on all of these things, because one of the scariest results in social science, at least my corner of social science, is how quickly you can lose your anti-corruption norms, how important they are to stop people acting corruptly, and how very, very difficult it is to get them back when they're gone. And the kind of the support for kleptocracy and the collapse in norms that might be going on, we need to do more research to figure out if it is going on, is I think, as John suggested, a very dangerous existential threat to decent government and decent life. And they were the things that jumped out at me from reading it. Good news, but also worrying signs.
Thanks, Rob. Roberto, did you, I mean, in terms of the overall findings, was there anything that struck you about Ireland? Do they point to, I want to ask you, declining rates, because we can't really tell, but are the results good or bad news or mediocre news?
So, I mean, I think if you look at the results and you see where Ireland is placed in most of the questions, you'll see that they are, doing better than average in terms of like the EU. I had conversations also with some of the media outlets in like Denmark, Sweden, the Netherlands, that are some of the other countries that are also in a similar position, right? And I think the message here is precisely what Rob was just saying. It's even though these countries might seem to be doing better than their European counterparts, I think what is very important is not to to think, great, we're doing well. It's like, let's not fall into complacency in this regard, because as Rob was saying, once your norms start backsliding a little bit, it opens a really dangerous precedent, so to speak, right? So there really is a need to keep an eye on even like this small changes, like the direction of the change, right? Because even though, as Rob was saying, even if you just have this like 8% of people saying that I would tolerate corruption if the government delivers good results, with the rise of populism in many European countries, it could happen in Ireland as well, right? So, and then you see those numbers that appeared as minorities at some point, like they just start like increasing like rapidly, right? And then it's going to be very hard for the institutions and for the institutions and the government to regain the trust of these individuals. So I think the message and what I see in Ireland is like, you might be doing well, but that is like, that doesn't mean that you do not need to like stay on your toes and continue moving forward. And also, I think the part of the use of personal connections to access services, that's something that we charted for the very first time this year. And there is no previous benchmark for that. Then you could then argue on whether 28% is too much or too little. I would still say, if you're aiming at a public service sector that is fair, gives equal access to everyone, 28% is 28% too much. So I think it is an important question to start looking from, for the government to start looking into, well, how do we reduce this, right? How do we get this to a lower level? And I think one of the solutions, if you look at Estonia, for example, even though the survey was conducted in the height of the pandemic, right? The levels of personal connections, the levels of bribery and so on in Estonia have declined massively just because of this investment in electronic government services, right? So once you're behind a computer, so to speak, then there's no public official with discretion to say, oh, I'll help you like jump the queue for the vaccine, or I'll help you jump the queue for this other thing. So I think in that regard, there's still a lot of room for Ireland to improve. And finally, this not related to Ireland anymore, but like to one of the questions that Rob posted earlier about the issue of sextortion. This is a question that we introduced into the survey when we started, in Latin America, so in the middle of the wave, so to speak, because we thought it is important to give visibility to this issue. But indeed, it's a very delicate topic, right? And it is very difficult to ask this to a person over the phone. So, or in person even, so as you say, it might be heavily underreported, because these are also issues that you might not want to open up about to a full stranger over the phone, or I don't know what's more uncomfortable, talking about sextortion to someone that comes to your house and asks you about this, or to someone over the phone, right? So I think this is just a way in which we want to start raising awareness as well about the problem, because as you were saying as well, we might say like, well, 4% probably is not a lot, but this is not something that you get over as easily as having had to pay like 50 euros for this or that, right? So I think this is just an attempt for us to like bring visibility to the issue, right? Rather than to the number of people itself. To just know, like, you know, this is happening in your country. You need to look at that. But indeed, one of the weaknesses of like any survey in this regard is that, you know, this type of practice is going to be underreported, and we also don't know, because it's also not easy to, you know, inquire about people's background. I think it would be really interesting to know which are the groups that are suffering from this, because there are many of the vulnerable groups, such as, you know, it can be LGBTQ people, it can be migrants, it can be those groups that are, so to speak, less empowered, right? That have like, that are not as well integrated in society, but we cannot really find out through the survey. So I think any further research on this issue would be incredibly valuable.
And just to be clear, I didn't mean any kind of criticism of your thing by saying it was underreported. I mean, I think you've started a conversation, not just in Ireland, but you know, everywhere this survey has been done, and it's something. I mean, e-government was proposed by, I think it was the Behavioural Insights team in the UK, as a way to fight sextortion, because if you don't have to go to the office, it's, you know, much more difficult, particularly for women, to be victims of this this kind of offence. I mean, just backtrack a little bit. I mean, something occurred to me there when you talking about the connections rate. Again, I mean, we shouldn't forget that if 28% of people have used their connections to jump the queue, that's 28% of people, ish, who have lost out on services. And again, that will be a case where it's the less powerful, the more disadvantaged, those with existing suffering from existing inequalities will be losing out. And it is the case that corruption is always, or almost always, falling more heavily on disadvantaged groups.
Yeah, I mean, on that, I mean, we made the point earlier that we operate the Speak Up helpline. We've had a relatively small number of queries or calls to it from vulnerable groups, including migrants, and some anecdotal evidence of abuses in direct provision. For example, people seeking asylum will have been, for a number of decades here, have been located in hotels or hostels, or in some cases tourist camps, and they have so a number of them reported abuses by people responsible for their care. In the report, I've just posted a link there to it as well, published by TI recently. It was also reported that sex workers are particularly vulnerable to blackmail and sextortion by police. Is a problem around the world. It's a massive problem in humanitarian aid provision, so we know, which isn't an issue here, largely speaking, but there are still vulnerable groups who are exposed to this risk. And as I said, and I think I underestimated the numbers of people, if projected across the workforce here, we'd be looking at about 100,000 people who said that they've been the victims of this type of crime. So the numbers are not insignificant, even if the margin of error was 3%. And 1% of people had said they were the victims of sextortion. That would be in the region of 25,000 people here. So it's something that should prompt some reflection by policymakers. I know it appeared there was some reference to it in a recent Garda inspector report into preventing corruption in the Irish Police Service. But it's something that suggests has not really been discussed as much as it should. We have a couple of questions coming in here as well, and one person had asked whether they believed that, or whether we believe that the EU whistleblowing directive will have an impact on the number of people saying they would fear speaking up. I mean, if you look at the figures, I'm sorry I didn't have the slides up, there are jurisdictions in which, such as Finland, that don't have as advanced whistleblower legislation as the case as is the case in Ireland. And I think as much as anything, culture has a big role to play here. Countries like Sweden have had freedom of information laws and some whistleblower protections since 1766. They have much more open societies than Ireland. Even Ireland does, even though Ireland is faring relatively well. And we know from data here and elsewhere that there's a 1 in 4 chance of you facing retaliation for speaking up, irrespective of the laws that are in place. So I'm not sure whether the directive will have that big an impact on this figure. And it is an indicative of a fear as much as reality or perceptions as well as reality. And we need to address that not just through legislation, I think you'll agree, but through education and concerted efforts aimed at shifting or changing culture and norms around speaking up.
Maybe just a tangent on that, John, if you don't mind. I mean, and Roberto hinted at this earlier on. I mean, there are countries out there that are very clean in terms of corruption and don't have much by way of protections against corruption because they think they don't need them. It's a very good idea to put them in when you don't need them, because who's in charge of the country when you do need them? The corrupt people. And it's kind of obvious who watches the watchers point, but we've done some research on this, and people who act corruptly themselves are less likely to tie their own hands, even if they are willing to tie the hands of other people who are acting corruptly. So getting those kind of things into Finland, where I lived for many years, it's a great country. Getting them into, I think the Danes also have limited defenses. Do it while you can. I hope you never need them, I think is about the soundest bit of policy advice I'll ever give.
Yeah. I mean, our emphasis is on risk as much as reality here. So you can't judge, or you shouldn't. And I've always argued that you shouldn't rely on evidence or the lack of evidence as proof of absence. And the fact is that corruption happens behind closed doors. It's not done in the open for obvious reasons. And we would see these figures change radically if there was a case, a high profile case in the media tomorrow. So we would see an impact on public trust, I'm sure. Public trust is relatively high right now, I think in part because of the government's perceived response to the pandemic. I mean, the response rates were relatively high here. I think 66% of people said that they believed there was adequate transparency around the Irish government's response to COVID-19. And that's reflected well in terms of trust in the government right now. But that, as we've seen from previous surveys, can change very quickly. And we've seen fluctuations in responses in the Barometer in previous years as well. We had a question from someone who's asking about greenwashing as well in the fossil fuel industry and what our view was on this. I think, I mean, Roberto, if you have any views on this, I think it's becoming harder for companies to hide than was the case. Their failure to meet their anti-corruption obligations. As we said, we recently published National Integrity Index on the private sector here, showing that less than that no company, no company has scored more than 70% on the index, and there's a clear need for companies to demonstrate their commitment to tackling corruption. Again, this is not an issue that has really been discussed by the private sector here, in large part because there have been so few prosecutions, unlike in the US or the UK. Rob, did you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so the particular instance of greenwashing and environmental stuff is not something I have any particular expertise on. I do have some PhD students who are doing work on I might call it reputation laundering, whereby, is there links between tax evasion or tax avoidance? I should be very careful. Tax avoidance by multinationals and their corporate social responsibility actions. And there does seem to be a link that, it's situational and depends on what the company you're looking at and what context you're looking at. I would love it if we could get to a situation where citizens care enough about corruption, like the way they do about the environment, such that firms went out and tried to launder their reputation by acting in a very anti-corrupt way. I think that would be great. Now, it's a complicated thing, but if I don't think they necessarily they would stop doing bad things, but at least they'd be doing extra good things. And I think that, again, the importance of shoring up not just citizens' anti-corruption norms, but corporate anti-corruption norms is really important. So I'm all for a push. I think we, this whole, United Against Corruption hashtag and stuff like that, I think we need to really try and build up a global movement where the fight against corruption, and again, John and Roberto are deeply involved in this, but the fight against corruption is seen as important as the fight for all the other sustainable development goals. And I'd be all for a bit of corruption washing, or whatever we want to call it, a better term for it.
Yeah.
No, so, I just wanted to add that I fully agree with John and with you as well, Rob. I think the good news, I think, is that it is indeed becoming harder for companies to greenwash their names or to do this, because I think there are like many more civil society groups now trying to bring attention to this issue, right? There's a lot of investigative journalism as well doing great work on this issue. So I think the more people pay attention to this, the least likely it will be that companies will get away with it. And I think what I think is the next frontier in corruption as well is precisely to tackle that part of the corporate sector corruption, right? Because at the moment, I think the whole business of compliance is like what has been seen as the solution. But there are now also criticisms, for example, coming from the US to say, well, this is just a very expensive machinery that doesn't really bring any change, right? At the same time, it is the same companies that do not really want that system to bring that much of a change because it can hurt their business elsewhere, right? So I think part of what the Global Corruption Barometer is showing is that now people are also starting to see, well, corruption is not only about the public sector, like companies also have a role to play here. And it is time for us to start looking at that as well. Of course, it is much more difficult, right, to criticize openly a company than it is to criticize a government. So I think that will be the next step.
Make two additions to that. I think I agree with it all. One is, you're right, it is harder to criticize companies, and that's why we need to do very careful work, in particular in Ireland, on press freedom laws and freedom of speech. That it has to be possible to raise issues without fear of kind of retaliation to silence you. That is extraordinarily important. The other thing I was going to say is I hate the word compliance. I hate it. Every time I hear about compliance.
Join the club, yes.
Because that's the problem, right? It's seen as something they have to do. We are compliant with the law, but no more. And if we do want to build up kind of corporate anti-corruption laws, corporate anti-corruption norms, I think we need to try very hard to push people to start seeing anti-corruption as something that they are just as important a commitment to as they do for environmental and social sustainability. Because corruption, it's harder to get all those other things. if you've got corruption.
Yeah,
I couldn't agree more on your earlier point, Rob, about press freedom and need for defamation reform here. But
long overdue.
The point I was going to make is that there, as we said, there's been very little discussion in Ireland in particular around the need for, I use the word compliance, for the need for a stated commitment or public commitment to tackling corruption risks. I might want to reframe this as well by suggesting that they also commit more to transparency and openness in their business practices. And multinational corporations should be disclosing tax on a country-by-country basis. We know there will be movement on this at the EU level, but it doesn't go far enough. So more commitment needed to publishing details of their activities around tackling corruption, corporate political engagement as well. So the findings around illicit influence were far more worrying or negative than was the case with traditional forms of transactional corruption, bribery, and so on. So the public still believe, in spite of the fact that bribery might not be as big a problem here, that private interests exert a much greater deal of influence over public policy than they should. And it's incumbent on the private sector as the sector which is most active in attempting to, we know this from data from the EU and particularly the EU register, transparency register, and that there's a role for the private sector to play in building public trust in a policy making process by being far more open about their engagement. And right now they're complying with their obligations under, for example, the Regulation of Lobbying Act or transparency register rules in Brussels, but they're not going far enough. They're not proactively sharing information. They're not proactively stating their commitment to political neutrality, for example. Much of this can be found in our recent report. And in making that commitment and in a way, if you like, transparency washing, or an attempt, it might be perceived as an attempt to transparency wash their activities, they're making a statement against which they can be held to account. They say nothing, you can't hold them to account for anything other than their failure to comply with the law. If they make a normative commitment, if they say, yes, we will publish this information, yes, we will be far more open, and they fail to be open, or they fail to publish information, then civil society can hold them to account for their failure to meet their own stated commitments. So these norms do matter. And it's one of the reasons why we launched Integrity at Work, which is aimed at committing employers to protecting their staff if they speak up and making sure they're signposted to supports and that they take action in response to concerns. So there's a risk attached to them trying to greenwash or transparency wash their reputations. They can be held to account for those stated commitments too. We had a question as well about the role of racism or perceived racism, and I think I pointed already in Ireland, and it's one of the participants is saying that racism is institutionalized in Ireland, and whether that compounds perhaps fear around reporting corruption. I think this would be particularly so for more vulnerable groups. I don't know if you agree, who, I mean, irrespective of their race, English may not be their first language, for example, and we're reporting concerns. We're doing some work around this ourselves at the moment with support of the Economic Relief Fund and the Community Foundation in providing more support for people, for migrants and other vulnerable workers, whether they be, Brazilians working in Irish meat plants, or Romanians working on building sites, that they have information they need to be able to report corruption. And we've seen this again in direct detention centres amongst asylum seekers. They're extremely vulnerable, particularly when they don't know how to avail of their rights.
One thing I suspect that racism is a kind of a force multiplier for corruption as well, in that it's probably much easier to extract bribes or sexual favors from people that you've kind of relegated in your mind to a category of other or lesser. And I think that we need to, these are all bad norms, to give them the politest possible term, right? These are horrible attitudes to have in the world, that it's okay to abuse your public position, and it's okay to think about people as some other people as being lesser than you are. And I think we need to tackle all of that at the same time, to really make it. Because again, going back to what John said, we know it around the world, corruption, the burden falls disproportionately on already vulnerable communities, and in vulnerable communities, it's more true than anywhere else that corruption kills.
I mean, this was particularly evident. I mean, just to use the old, I hate to refer back to Nazi Germany, but I mean, the state-sponsored kleptocracy and looting of Jews by presenting them or framing them as the other. And we saw the role that corruption played in Nazi Germany. It actually helped unravel the Nazi state too, but it was part of Nazi ethos, effectively, to loot, to steal, effectively, a sizable the property of a sizable proportion of population's assets.
You also see it that countries with governments who are prone to a bit of kleptocracy themselves, or outright corruption, often talk about building walls and keeping people out. In other words, you rile up a base of your country, promise them something that they want, which of course is not something they should want, either morally or the economic evidence, I think is clear. You give them something to be angry about, and then you steal yourself. And I think Caroline is spot on. There is a strong link between racism and corruption as an enabling force and as a moderating force. In this case, of course, moderating, we mean it makes it worse.
Yeah, we see this.
Just if I could, I mean, if I could add to that, just as a, maybe like an ad, so almost, we will be publishing a report next month precisely on how corruption affects different vulnerable groups, including indigenous people, like indigenous populations, LGBTQ, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It is a project in which we collaborated with other NGOs as well, to bring visibility precisely to this issue. And I think you're totally right. And even if you just think about, what are the mechanisms that fuel corruption in a way, right? Like you need to have, I mean, if you just go back to the oldest of research on corruption, is like it happens when you have a lot of discretion, you're right, you have the power, and you don't really have accountability. And when you're dealing with groups that are seen as disempowered, then if you're like in a position of power, then it's like, there's very little that you'll see. I mean, there's a very low chance that you'll be punished for that, right? These people will not even be able to complain. They won't be able to hold you to account. They don't have a representative in government they can complain to either. So I think that is precisely why it is also so worrying and important to look at this issue. And of course, I mean, I don't know much about the issue of like racism in Ireland, but I mean, it is a problem, I think, in most countries, that these disempowered groups can indeed be more vulnerable to corruption as well.
Yeah, well, we're seeing this in, for example, Brazil, Bolsonaro regime, and use of aggressive nationalism, and ethno-nationalism there. to deprive indigenous groups of their rights as a pretext, in large part, to engage in a campaign of land grabs across the Amazon to clear it for farming and mining. It's not the only country, of course, where this is happening, but it's very easy to steal someone's land if you say that if you delegitimize or belittle the status of the people who own that land. Sorry, Robert, that you were.
One more time, because I think Caroline's question was brilliant, because it got me thinking about all kinds of things that I probably should have been thinking about in a more systematic way for a long time. I mean, there's another way in which racism and corruption are similar, in that, as we said earlier, it's very hard to get your anti-corruption norms back when they're gone, because there's a coordination problem. Or it's very hard and of little benefit to you to be the only honest person in a corrupt group, right? And I think it's probably similar in terms of people escaping from having the bad way of thinking that is racism, that it's very, very difficult to become the first non-racist person in a racist institutional environment. I think that's there not only means it's hard to escape that as an individual, but also organizations with institutionalized racism attract racists. And I think it's probably the same for institutionalized corruption. People self-select into it because it provides an opportunity to exercise that behavior. And I think I don't know enough about this myself. I'm going to have a search through the literature later, but it's certainly something I will think about more going forward. So thank you for that question, Caroline.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we touched on this before when we launched our first National Integrity System study, 2009. I pointed it to the role of conflict in Northern Ireland as a context within which corruption could be justified at the time. And I remember a journalist, I don't know, it was Frank MacDonald of the Irish Times, who said, or maybe Kevin Myers, who wanted to report on the wealth of Charles Haughey at the time. And he was heavily discouraged by the editor of the Times at the time, because it would be seen to interfere with Haughey's negotiations around with the British government at the time. I'm not quite sure exactly what negotiations were taking place, but we've seen similar trends in Israel, for example, with conflict there in Palestine with fairly high-profile corruption allegations and prosecutions taken against Benjamin Netanyahu recently. Before him, we say who Barak as well. Corruption or conflict, rather, along with racism, a narrative around populist narratives that suggest that the state is under threat from a group or an outside threat, an internal group or an outside threat, can provide cover for kleptocrats to, for example, introduce new emergency powers that give them the opportunity, to provide them with the opportunity to engage in corruption, or to silence internal opponents or journalists too. So it's something that I think we need to be mindful of. Thankfully, I mean, for now we're in an era of unprecedented political stability here right now, which is largely reflected, I think, in these findings. But at the same time, it's something we can't be complacent about too. I'm not sure we have any more questions. Rob, did you have any final thoughts?
Just when you're talking, I thought, tying back what you said about kleptocrats, populists, and stuff. I mean, that goes back to this idea of the worry that I have about the tolerance of corrupt governments that are delivering. I mean, at least in some of these countries, I suspect what they're delivering on are xenophobic policies that people are willing to, to trade off against grand corruption. So yeah, even more than at the start of this session, it's really interesting. I think we need to think more about that that tolerance of corruption, constituency of kleptocrats. It needs careful monitoring.
Yeah, and it's just add to that. I mean, it wasn't just. It would appear it's not just those who would vote for right-wing parties either that might be tolerant of corruption. It seemed, I mean, we saw in France with Mitterrand, for example, was a socialist but a crook, and so long as politicians are seen to deliver for the constituents, and you pointed to the role of localism or clientelism in any system, or patronage in fomenting or in supporting tolerance of corruption. As long as we're blind to the risks associated with those particular political practices or trends, we're likely to see a growing tolerance or persistent tolerance of corruption in public office. Roberto, did you have any concluding thoughts or remarks?
Any final thoughts? Well, I guess just from with my role of like the person who produced the survey, so to speak, I'm happy to see that this type of work can spark these discussions and serve as a as like evidence as well to start looking at these things, because I think that often in the in the anti-corruption field and so on, we look down at perceptions in a way, because they are not this like objective data of like I mean, I want to know exactly how much corruption happens in this country and in what sector and so on. And of course, there's huge value in doing that, right? But I think the type of tool that we have with the Global Corruption Barometer, and also to a certain extent with the Corruption Perceptions Index, is just the importance of perceptions. Because as Rob said as well, people are going to make decisions based on those perceptions. They don't really care, if they're telling you that if 65% of them believe that all companies are using bribes or connections to get government contracts, that's what they are going to go to the polls with, especially if you're in a democratic setting, right? So I think that even if there is no, I mean, there has to be something behind that idea, and we need to find exactly what is fueling that. And I think that is then our task as researchers, NGOs, and also for the government, right? And that's what you need to also work with these perceptions and integrate them into your path towards creating like a better government and society in general. So I just hope that we can continue to use like this data in a positive way to drive change as well, because I mean, one of the things is it's also very difficult sometimes to get money or funding to compile this data for countries like the European Union, where you have the perception that everything is fine, right? And I hope that at least the results in this survey show that, well, not everything is fine, and there are some trends here that we need to look at, that we need to keep an eye on, and that we need to monitor. So I mean, even in Ireland, even in Sweden, even in Denmark, we need to keep an eye on this. So I'm just happy to see that the results are meaningful for also for the national context. That would be it from my side.
Roberto, I have nothing to add to that, but very lucidly. And thanks again for your work. Well done on the publication of the report. Thanks for joining us, Rob. Thanks for joining us as well. And this will be posted on YouTube for anyone who wants to watch it back. We'll also provide some of the links to the studies we were talking about there too. Thanks again to all our participants, people who joined us, posted questions, and we'll see you again, I hope soon. Enjoy the rest of your day, and see you anon. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.